Grief is not something that is often discussed in Canadian society, and grief education in general is often neglected, and numerous myths exist around grief. Dying with Dignity Canada's mission is that through advocacy, public education, and personal support, Dying with Dignity Canada ensures Canadians have access to quality end of life choice and care. It can be argued that quality end of life care transcends into grief education, as it is something that affects not only the dying person, but the family and friends left behind. Grief literacy is in no way a clinical offering, but instead is one that focuses on public education. I'd now like to invite all of you watching from home to light a candle if you feel called to do so and if your space allows it, to honor the people we are speaking about today and anyone in your own life who is top of mind during today's session. So today's topic is cultural humility and grief, and we're joined by Rami Shami, who has been serving within hospice palliative care for over 3 decades. He feels privileged to practice as a consultant, as well as case manager for the Second Mile Club at Kensington Health, and the Multicultural Outreach Coordinator for Lighthouse for Grieving Children. While harvesting a conviction that everyone should have access to quality hospice palliative care, Rami strongly advocates and supports the development and growth of programs and services for those traveling the journey of a life-limiting illness, their caregivers, and those who are bereaved. So with that said, I will turn it over to you, Rami.
Thank you, Kelsey. Let me get myself all set up. You know what, I got to shorten that bio. I keep using it, and we got to get something a little. Hi, I'm Rami Shami. I'm here to talk about cultural humility, and that's enough. Anyways, because I'm a bit shy and sheepish that way. So, anyways, welcome. I am excited. I am humbled, and I'm privileged to be speaking to you today about cultural humility and grief with Dying with Dignity Canada. Thank you, Nicole and Kelsey, for bringing me to this platform to be able to share this all with you. It's a very strong aspect of my passion within the work, and actually the vocation, the life course that I have chosen for the past 30 odd years. And thank you as well, Dying with Dignity Canada, for a land acknowledgement. I won't reiterate. However, you can imagine how many times I present, and I present a lot, locally, nationally, internationally, how often we don't have a land acknowledgement, especially after reconciliation, especially after everything that happened. We're going to talk about cultural humility. We absolutely must acknowledge the land that we are. So thank you, Dying with Dignity, for enforcing that and for representing that. I wish I had a day with you to talk about cultural humility. I would wrap it in trauma-informed care. I'd bring in personal culture. I'd bring in harm reduction. I would bring in anti-oppression and anti-racism, all aspects of cultural humility. And in an hour, really, it's just scratching the scratch of the surface. But I hope to leave some measure of enthusiasm, some measure of advocacy and inspiration with you as I speak to you about something that I feel should be in every aspect of social services, death care, death and dying care, or maybe even our school systems. And we're going to talk about sex, and we're going to talk about Trump, and we're going to talk about iPads and social media. Why are we not talking about cultural humility, especially as it applies to grief? It is a cornerstone and a foundational principle of grief support. And I say that because every single one of us has experienced some aspect of loss. I don't have to get into what grief is and how it is in that regard, but grief expresses itself through all the measures of loss. I mean, the death piece, of course, is the foundation of my work, is actually a small part, I find, of grieving, because we grieve so much, and the diversity within the way we grieve through what's called personal culture, through called individuality and self-expression, as exemplified and articulated through the practice and ideology of cultural humility, is immeasurable. If there's 8 billion people on this earth, 8 billion people will grieve uniquely. And yet we have these categories of what's called cultural competence and cultural sensitivity and grouping people in stages that is completely antiquated, outdated, and inappropriate. And that's why I'm excited to speak to you about this aspect of cultural humility. My road through death care, you might say, I like to say death care because it's wind and it's turned, has been storied and tenured. 30 plus years, 17, 20 different hospice palliative care programs and palliative care units locally, across the country, down to the States and into Trinidad. And we were just about to go to Zimbabwe to start working with Dr. Thistle and his work there in a palliative care perspective when COVID hit. I've seen a lot of death, and I've seen a lot of changes in death care and grief support over the past 30 years. I mean, look at where MAID has come from now. I mean, 10 years ago, even 6, 7 years ago, I wasn't even allowed to mention it. And in some hospice palliative care programs, I'm still not allowed to speak to it because of the political climate within those organizations. But that's not what we're here for. We're here to exemplify something this incredible woman that I had the privilege and honor of meeting quite a few years ago, and that's June Caldwood. She, for me, exemplified trauma-informed approaches as established and garnered through a culturally humble approach. What is cultural humility? I'm going to explain it to you in many different ways so that you can look at it from different perspectives. But the essence of cultural humility is the purest and most authentic expression of ourselves in the here and now. Because this aspect of grouping people into cultural categories is not appropriate, nor is it accurate. The idea of personal culture is to see the person for who they are and to receive from the person how they are in this present moment of time and space. And that's what June Cald did for me in that moment many moons ago. She was dying then. She had cancer and she died soon after this particular photo that I had the privilege of meeting her. She made me feel in that particular moment, or I felt in her presence in that particular moment, more in the presence of somebody's awareness than at ever time in my life before or after. And to me, that's the essence of cultural humility, is to receive who I am and what I am here and now. And why I emphasize here and now, because there's an evolution to who we are here and now. And that's why our personal culture, what it was 5 minutes ago or 10 years ago, is different from what it is now. And it's different from what it'll be in 5 minutes or 10 years from now. And that's the nimbleness and the evolution of the concept and ideology and practice of cultural humility that I've adopted in my work. And as I've mentioned, I've seen a lot of death, a lot of struggle, a lot of pain, a lot of joy, a lot of celebration, a lot of grief in 3 decades and counting. I don't feel like I'm going anywhere anytime soon. I survived COVID, so I've been on the front lines of COVID. And as Kelsey was kind enough to speak, I'm a case manager in a hospice. I work also as a caregiver support in a long-term care facility and in the community. I'm a hospice palliative care consultant. I sit at bedside. I provide bereavement support. I run a whole bereavement support program. And I do a lot of training and education and teaching and consulting across palliative care programs, death doula programs, and what have you across the great region. But why I emphasize that is not to really show off or even a badge of honor. It's because I feel like I could speak with some measure of not authority, but maybe some measure of experience and knowledge about the importance of cultural humility and personal culture within any engagement of what we'd call death care or death and dying, because of the transient, evolutionary nature, dynamic nature of death and dying, because of the evolutionary, dynamic, and transitory nature of even grief and bereavement support, of grieving, and how it can actually change and work with us and infuse and infect and change and metamorphosize who and what we are. And that becomes our personal culture. And that's the essence of cultural humility. See, I'm already getting excited about this. See this, Kelsey, Nicole, once you get me started on this stuff, I wish I had, honestly, usually this what I'm going to show you today is usually something that I teach over 3 or 4 hours, right? So we're going to hit it hard. A lot of my work also has been on the streets of Toronto. This is a gentleman that we were supporting people experiencing homelessness and who are living with a life-limiting illness, a progressive life-limiting illness. And the whole aspect of homelessness, traumatization, living rough, and a palliative diagnosis and a living with a life-limiting illness really exemplifies and really brings to light and awareness the concept of personal culture. And you'll see as I move through this through this presentation how that can be. When we look at the impact of traumatization, which 70 to 80% of Canadians experience at least one traumatizing event in their lives, how we look at our living conditions here and now, our social economic background, of course, how we identify sexually, our gender and what have you, all these other influences, but all the other aspects that make us who we are that are not on a checklist of an intake form that is considered culture, right? And that's why a lot of what we do and how we do it within grief and bereavement support and in death care and all the measures of death care need to change. We need to look at and embrace the individual so much more. I learned that clearly working on the streets of Toronto, working with people experiencing homelessness. You notice I never say the homeless, because the homeless is not a culture in and of itself. Homelessness is not a culture. It doesn't have a culture, right? We have to come back to the individual. When you talk to many people living on the streets of Toronto or living rough or living in shelters, you recognize that they have a story and all the influences that turn that story into an aspect of who and what they are in the definition of their personal culture. Another program that I work with is a children's grief center. And it's amazing to see, I'm so proud to be with this organization. It's amazing to see the impact of grief, whether it's traumatizing or however it changes, it affects them. The impact of grief on a child, the impact of lack of peer support and peer support on how a child processes, navigates, grows with, if you might say, or even evolves with or through grief, and how it can be a part of who and what they are and how they define themselves. Grief and grieving, as many of you know, does not necessarily resolve, none of that bullshit, or we get over it. We grow and learn and be with it probably for the rest of our lives. It becomes a part of our makeup and who and what we are. And in its essence, it becomes the very fabric and tapestry of who we are, which is what we call personal culture. And in this evolution that we have with the impact of grief, there is a metamorphosis. Without getting too esoteric and artistic, I've seen in the 30 years, there's a metamorphosis with how we express ourselves, how we see life, how we see death, how we see dying, how we engage grief and grieving, how we look at all these aspects of our life through the dynamic and evolutionary nature of how our personal culture takes place. And that aspect of personal culture has so many influences, what I'm going to speak about today, that it's impossible not to talk about personal culture, which is the foundation of cultural humility, and still be able to look at grief and grieving the same way. There's such, you all probably know, and maybe not, maybe this is what you've come to learn. There's a uniqueness to grief and grieving that is an exemplification of somebody's individuality. And we can't categorize people according to who we think their culture is so that we can provide them grief support. So much of grief support out there, I say out there, so much of the grief support I've been experienced or been a part of, or building programs, what have you, starts with what can we provide in terms of grief and grieving, and then builds from that how somebody can be supported, rather than the other way around. There's an individuality to grieving. There's an individuality to engaging loss and experiencing and processing loss that is foundational within who and what we are in the ideology of personal culture. I've been part of a few years now outreach project that looks at not a small, but an aspect of diversity and what have you, and culture and all those domains, and that's multiculturalism. And just within that scope, and it was from the lens of grief and grieving, all right, not even grief support, but just grief and grieving. In this outreach project that I engaged in all of Southern Ontario, we found these influences, or I found these influences to almost be more powerful on how people grieved, how people were in what states of bereavement they were in, how they mourned, than almost anything else, than more than necessarily language or community influences or religion. These are the things that we don't often take into perspective when we're looking at grief and grieving and states of bereavement. And these are the aspects that are almost a stronger influence on our personal culture than almost anything else. We look at the measures of diversities I'll talk to you about something called cultural competence. We look at the measures of diversities within communities, that communities actually have diversity within themselves. We look at the impact of immigration and the losses that people might have experienced in emigrating to Canada, and how when they have, a death-related loss here, and that grief, how it's exasperated through how they define themselves as immigrants. We look at even intergenerational, especially we might be speaking to a lot of people from across the land, across the world, but Southern Ontario and Canada especially has a strong intergenerational component to it. And that's intergenerational component to it has exemplifies the aspect of personal culture. An intergenerational component has a very unique way within how each individual processes, engages, and is with grief. We haven't even looked at the influences of social media. I mean, how many of you are Apple users and how many are Android users? That's a culture in all of itself, and how it influences us, and the influence of social media on who each and every one of us is as a person. Did you know 76 to 80% of Canadians have experienced at least one traumatizing event in their lives? And how can we look at grief without looking at aspects of traumatization that we may have experienced in our lives? And most of us have. And that becomes part of who and what we are, and how we perceive ourselves, and how we even express ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, because a lot of traumatization is somaticized and is expressed through the body. We started to identify and acknowledge gender specificity. We started to look at even at pronouns. You don't get more personal individual than that. And that is a measure with which grief is processed or even engaged. We've looked at insulation within communities and within peoples about what they would consider almost permissioned ways to grieve. Did you know in some languages, there isn't even the words to say grief and grieving? They have different ways. They either have verbs, but they don't have the noun of it, or they don't have the identity of it, right? And how that influences how they process grief through their own unique individuality. Now with COVID, we have an explosion of domestic violence, which exasperates the fight or flight response, which has nothing to do with cultural freaking competence. Sorry, I get a little fired up about cultural competence and sensitivity. I'm strongly like to change that, although a lot of organizations are still speaking to it. Domestic violence is an all-time high. That can change who and what we are. It can exasperate our fight or flight, and can change how we navigate grief and grieving. Many individuals who work with on the streets of Toronto speak about one night in the street and all the aspects of how it changes who and what we are just by our geography or our living conditions. We have a whole program, I think, at Laurier or Guelph that talks about natural disasters and climate change and the grief involved in that, and how each and every one of us will see our futures and project into our futures through that unique lens. And then there's medical trauma. Like myself, I experienced a lot of childhood developmental trauma and medical trauma. It has nothing to do with language or ethnicity or where my parents have come from or what I believe in or my spirituality. That in and of itself has become part of who and what I am, and probably is why I'm sitting here in front of you. It's become part of my personal culture. And if we don't have a toolkit, if we don't have an approach with which to engage these aspects of diversity, these aspects of personal culture, then we'll never really be present with our grief or with another's grief in its appropriate or fullest extent. So I just want to frame this. I get asked a lot where I'm from, because I used to travel a lot before COVID. Remember COVID, before we could travel and what have you. I get asked a lot. I say, I'm Canadian. And then somebody would say, oh, so you like hockey? I say, I hate hockey. I don't correlate being Canadian with hockey. And I'm sorry to all the Leafs fans out there. They lost again, and the Canadians swept the Jets. I don't like hockey. It's not a part of who and what I am. Then they ask me, where are your parents from? I say, my dad's from Israel, my mom's from Lebanon. And either they go, oh, you're Israeli, or you're Lebanese. Oh, you must like falafel. I'm like, I hate falafel. I don't like falafel. I have no interest in the foods that I eat. And you can see how I'm building this, okay? Maybe you can see how I'm building this, because these are aspects, usually when you find out who and what somebody is or what they tell you, you start to assume, or we start to assume, that these are aspects of culture, activities, identity, flags, food. So you say you don't like falafel? What do you mean you don't like falafel? Oh, your dad's from Israel. Maybe you like hummus. I said, why don't you try to say hummus like the way I say hummus? And I don't even like hummus. If somebody were to ask me, truly be present with me in a humility where they're not stereotyping me or trying to put me in a box or trying to figure out who and what I am, if they were to truly ask me, you know what I would say? I would say, I'm hospice. I'm end of life. I'm death care. I'm grief and bereavement. I'm maid support. I'm caregiver support. That's what I am. That's what I am all about. And that's where I feel that's my personal culture. And that's what we need to look at some of the most vulnerable, stressful, trying, challenging times, which is during loss. That's usually when our personal culture is exasperated. And that's what June Caldwell did for me. She saw me and she asked me who I was without subjecting and assuming this cultural competence or cultural sensitivity approach by what we think we've learned and gained competency over of what we hear from somebody else. I don't like hockey. I'm Canadian. I don't identify with being Israeli or Lebanese, so I don't even like falafel or hummus. My mission and vision is all that I do with death and dying and grief and bereavement. So I'm going to get a little deeper into culture now. We're going to get a little bit more into the aspects of culture. There's a lot of terms you'll hear out there like cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, and you might ask yourself, what's the difference between cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, and cultural humility? 20, 30 years ago, we used to talk about something called cultural sensitivity, and then it moved and morphed into cultural competence. And today we are focused for a large part on something cultural humility, although organizations and social activists and people still talk about cultural competence. And I'm going to define them loosely for you, just to give you some basis by where we're going from here. Often when I do this kind of education or training, I ask others, what is culture? How do you define culture? Right? And this is a common definition that I hear: a set of shared values, attitudes, goals, beliefs, and practices that characterizes an institution, an organization, or a group. Now, what do you think is missing there? Maybe you want to put something up in the chat. I won't see it right away, but Kelsey and Nicole are kind enough, and I believe Samantha are kind enough to be on that. What is missing there when we talk about culture? So if you knew I was Israeli and Lebanese, and you knew I was Canadian, what are some of the stereotypes or the projections or the ideologies that we have about those peoples that characterize an institution, organization, or group? That's usually what we think of as culture, right? But there's something missing in that because of the list of the influences I already shared with you. Where's trauma? Where's immigration? Where's housing? Where's your social economic background? Where's your experiences with grief, your experiences with loss, your experiences with death, your experiences with change? What's missing in there is the individual. We can have, the focus is on the individual. The focus is on the personality within the individual culture. It can exist in a group, an organization, or an institution, and it presents itself and expresses itself through that setting, but it is not the setting. Okay. I was doing a bit of an audit with another organization, what's called a diversity audit, some of them that I do. And the characterizations, Italians are like this, Chinese are like this, Indigenous people, First Nations are like this, people who are identify as queer are like this. See how we group people? And a lot of organizations do that. A lot of us do that because it's easier to relate with, to categorize, to relate to. But it's wrong. It's actually one of the things that I will say is not appropriate, because we're losing the individual. And nothing individualizes us like grief, at least in my grief and trauma. Those are the things that make us very, very unique. And those are the parts that are an influence on personal culture, in my mind, like no other. A lot of times, I hear when we talk about culture, we talk about values, norms, and sense of space and communication and language and dress and appearance and food, time and relationships and friends and beliefs and attitudes and mental processing and work habits. Absolutely. But it's our individuality that expresses itself through those, not the other way around necessarily, not when it comes to grieving, not when it comes to death and dying. We are expressed through those. Not everybody from Germany or Holland is time conscious. Okay, not everybody's from North America or from Paris is dress and fashion awareness. These are stereotypes, and they're ways with which we lose sight of who and what we are as individuals. Yes, they can exist there. They can coexist. They can be expressed, but let's not use them as the measures of culture. Let's look at who and what the person is. I've learned this very clearly, very, very powerfully in death care. When I sit at the bedside of people who are living their last moments, or who are facing MAID, or who are in grief, okay? And if I'm truly present, like June Caldwood was with me, there's an essence and authenticity that is expressed from that person that transcends any kind of projected ideas of culture I have about them. Okay, that's what I've learned in being with death and dying and grief and bereavement. A lot of the training and education and measures of sensitivity that that we used to use came from the idea or recognition or awareness of what's called ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is this belief that my ethnic group or whatever is superior to yours. And you'll see, oops, sorry, I gave it away before I went. You'll see how that establishes two modes of, two approaches and sets them up for stereotyping and biased. This idea, this awareness of ethnocentrism lends itself to something called cultural sensitivity. Way back when, 30, 40, 50 years ago, there was this awareness that, well, you know, maybe we're being a little too ethnocentric. And I know I'm being a bit facetious and a bit generalizing, but this is kind of like how it happened. You know, we're a little bit ethnocentric, a little bit focused on ourselves, and we have all these immigrants and we have indigenous peoples and First Nations. You know, maybe we should try to become more sensitive to other people's differences. And the operative word there is other people's differences. So I'm going to become sensitive to other people's differences. And so we started training cultural sensitivity, how to be sensitive to somebody else's differences. So what's the problem there? What's the challenge there? And it is a problem, is that it's other focused. The sensitivity is outward facing. I am being sensitive to you being different. It lacks the perspective that you might be looking at me, seeing I'm just as different to you as you are to me. So it's from this ethnocentrism that we look out and we say, oh, I see something's different about you. Okay, you're different. So I'm going to be sensitive to your difference without looking at it from the other perspective and saying, oh, you must see me as just as different. Or maybe not. Maybe there might be a perspective that I'm just as different looking to you as you are to me. The sensitivity isn't reciprocated. It's one way. That is the legacy of ethnocentrism. And we went a step further. I was part of all this training 10, 15 years ago. In Hospice Palliative Care, that's all we did, you know, and that's why I'm a strong advocate of that, against that actually now in many, all the areas of death care that I train and teach in. So we thought, okay, here's how to be culturally sensitive. So what are we going to do about this? Oh, we got an idea. Let's become competent in the sensitivity. Let's learn what we think we know about that person because of what we see in them, or we read in textbooks or on Google, and let's create a manual about how to be sensitive to that person, and let's call it competence. So this is how Jews do death and grieving. This is how, you know, somebody who's trans or gay or Muslim or indigenous or, you know, Republican, put all these aspects of how somebody would be in death and dying and grief and bereavement. And we handed that to professionals and said, hey, when somebody is dying or somebody is facing MAID, or some, we don't do it now because it's a little bit different, of course, the MAID is newer than that. But we used to do that. And somebody's grief and bereavement, that's how they do all the worship. And you know what we found is that it was bullshit. It was total bullshit. It didn't work. How can you do that with people? How can you take somebody who's an individual, who is an expression, especially in the vulnerability of death and dying and in grief and bereavement, and engage them in a model that you've learned and stereotyped and conditioned yourself that they will act this way or they will do these rituals. You know how many times I've sat with people who are Muslim or Hindu, or they have nothing to do with the practices that they're talking about? I've sat with people who have come out at the bedside. I've sat with people who changed religions, changed spirituality, believed God, didn't believe in God, believed in MAID, didn't believe in MAID, just all over the place because of the dynamic nature of personal culture. And that's where the word humility comes from. The word humility comes from with being okay with not knowing, not just all the answers, any of the answers. I love this role. I play not knowing, which I call dumb, and I won't leave that with you, with the best of them. I love the opportunity to be with people in death and dying and grief and bereavement and not know anything. I don't often even look at the intake form. I'd like to be in a place where I receive for them what they want me to know in the here and now. And sometimes, yeah, I might miss things. Like they like this ritual or they like that, but I have them explain it to me. I have them to teach it to me through their lens and their perception and what's important to them. Not what we've been told on an intake form, not what they're, whatever they've designated as family, not whatever I've learned, okay, because they're wearing some kind of, customary, representation, but by what they've shared with me. And this is especially important in grief support, where we find different ways that are not necessarily what we've been conditioned or even told or taught, or whatever communities we're a part of have been projected on. If we come to it from a place of absolute humility and receive from the person what they want us to know and how to be with them, how to support them. And let me flip this. If we even look at it and empower ourselves and have a sense of autonomy and self-direction within ourselves, almost like a humility within ourselves, to permission ourselves to express grief in what resonates with us best, what aligns with us and feels most right. And that sometimes creates resistance from our environment, from our designated families, from our friends, from our work environments, because we choose to follow something that feels most appropriate in the moment, here and now, which may not be in the next week or two. And that's an aspect I'll read to you in a bit of cultural humility. That is an important piece, because it's all about what is happening here and now, and that might change in the future. And folks, I've sat with, I've been through a lot of processions, a lot of funerals. I mean, 30 years is a long time to be in the field. I'm sure many of you have been in the field a long time too. And I've had the honor and privilege in seeing how unique and individual and uncustomary it can be. That if we afford an environment where somebody can feel autonomy and self-direction and empowerment with grief and bereavement and death and dying, that's when we can see the authentic nature of somebody's being. That's when it's almost, there's almost a permissioning, an air of permissioning, where somebody can engage death and dying and grief and bereavement in their own unique individual ways, because those individual ways are all affected and by those influences that I mentioned to you. That's the humility that we have to. That's what stirs me in this work. That's what keeps me in this work. It's not just an abject concept of humility. It's a curiosity, even, a presence with that which I don't know, and I'm going to be taught. How more beautiful do you get than that, right? And I think that's a lot of what where a lot of death care and grief and bereavement is moving now. I think even by, if we want to talk about medical assistance in dying, I mean, that's a lot of my work too, because I support people who are bereaved when somebody, the family member or somebody they're caregiving for has received medical assistance in dying. I mean, it's through the listening practice and the advocacy for individuality that we got to where we are today. So how can we not engage in this aspect of an approach? And that's the essence of cultural humility. It's left cultural competence and cultural sensitivity in its box of bias and stereotyping. It's brought us to a place of courage to be in the presence of the unknown. That's where I live and breathe every single day. Not just with the people I serve, not just with my family and friends, but with myself. I mean, cultural humility isn't just an outward concept or approach. It's an inward concept that I'm constantly changing every day in who and what I was, how I navigate grief, how I process grief, how I look at death and dying. It's a road that I apply even to myself, because it's within myself that I serve and I engage the entire world or entire environment. I love this definition. This is the best definition I've ever read about cultural humility. And it comes from the First Nations Health Authority in BC. They published a report. They had a publication titled "Creating a Climate for Change." Hashtag it starts with me. And just hear the potency of their definition of cultural humility. Cultural humility is a process of self-reflection to understand personal and systemic biases and to develop and maintain respectful processes and relationships based on mutual trust. Cultural humility involves humbly acknowledging oneself as a learner when it comes to understanding another's experience. Where do you think all that starts? That starts with ourselves, a process of self-reflection. We look inward first. We look at not only personal biases, which we all have, many of us have, I shouldn't say all, I certainly have them, but we look at systemic biases within our healthcare, within our politics, within our community structures, within our legal system. We look at also the humility in acknowledging ourselves as constant learners, and constant learners, not just of those we engage, those we support, those we live with, but ourselves, right? That's the beauty of cultural humility. That's where the word humility intersects with culture, and then the bedrock of it being personal culture. I love this definition by Dr. Like. He says the essence of cultural competence is cultural humility. Having children, families, anyone we support, anyone we're with, teach us. And I left children in there because, working with a lot of children who are bereaved, who are grieving, I've never felt a depth of humility as I am, or I have to be with them because of the way they navigate and process grief. Having children and their families teach us what's relevant to them means an awareness of our own beliefs, our own biases and prejudices, and even implicitly so, and our own values. It's a matter of taking our own pulse. And what happens with our pulse? You know why Dr. Like uses that word in there, in pulse? Is because our pulse is always changing. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's irregular, sometimes you probably should have it checked out by a doctor, and sometimes it's subdued. And if we're constantly taking our own pulse, we're always in awareness, in a state of humility of what's happening within us as it interfaces with the environment, as we have different perspectives on who and what we are and who and what we're engaging with, especially and most importantly, in the context of grieving. And no doubt, cultural humility begins with us, right? It starts here. And it becomes two-way. Remember I talked about cultural sensitivity being one way, other focused? And you don't have to take my word up for it, just Wikipedia it, you'll see it. It talks about other focus, right? And cultural humility is two-way. There's multiple foci in there because the perspectives may be potentially very different in how we see one another. And not just how we see one another, but how we want to be seen, okay? And I love this process because this has been my life mission, my vocation. It's a lifelong process, commitment to self-reflection, self-critique, and self-awareness. And did you know that is a foundational principle even within anti-racism? That's a foundational principle within trauma-informed care, and it's embedded in the practices of cultural humility. It's something that I'm constantly engaged with. I've been asked many times, how would you survive so many years in this work? Right here. Self-reflection, self-critique, and self-awareness. It recognizes what cultural humility also does. It recognizes imbalances of power in check, because if we're looking inward, we're sensing how we're being engaged and how we're engaging, and this whole aspect of receivership, how I'm being received. Very importantly, it assesses the dimensions of each individual in you and ourselves in you, each and every day, each and every moment. We relinquish the expert role to the person, to someone else. We become somebody else's student. We become our own students, especially in the context of grief. And these are practices that we can do, each and every one of us, if we are in the care, or we are in the industry, in the service, or even within ourselves and our chosen families. Because we all have personal culture, folks. It impacts how we perceive, think, behave, interact, and make judgments about the world around us. Look at yourselves and look at your personal culture, who and what you are, and all those influences that feed into that aspect of a personhood and the context of culture. And I love this symbolism. This is one of my favorite symbolisms. And I owe commemoration to Japanese peoples that they brought this to light. It's called the Kinsugi bowl. The Kinsugi bowl is an aspect of a healing practice in Japanese tradition where something is broken apart and put back together and they paint the lines in gold. The important piece of that is that it's not necessarily that something is being healed, is that everything that's happened to me with this bowl is what I carry forth into my life. This is my life. This is who and what I am. the traumas, the influences. This is what I serve with. This is who I talk to. This is my personal culture. And this is our personal cultures. You can see so many bowls broken. You could buy the same exact bowl, 10 different bowls, and hit them, and they will all break a different way. That's life impacting somebody. And they're all the same bowl. They all look the same. They all wear the same clothes, the same food, and wear this, pray to the same God, but they break a different way. And if they break a different way, they've been changed by life. And if that breaking is an aspect of grieving, then that grief has changed them into their own personality. And if we talk about grieving being a process of giving internal meaning to our loss and how we feel inside, none of us feel the same way. You can never understand how somebody else feels. So whatever has influenced how we feel, not the feeling, but how we feel, must be a personal aspect of personal culture. In order to access that and be aware of it, it must be the approach of cultural humility. Because grief can affect us cognitively, intellectually, physically, behaviorally, spiritually, emotionally, socially. And yeah, those are all aspects of a group culture, but they're all very unique in how they interface in who and what we become in a personhood. And if they are aspects of our personhood, they are aspects of our personal culture, and thus they need a culturally humble approach to be either engaged or received from. And that lends itself to an entering. A lot of my work, when I enter people's homes, people's residences, people's bedsides, people's grief experiences and stories, I bring my whole self. This bullshit about leaving myself at the door and then stepping into the environment is an impossibility. We bring our whole selves in there. And if we bring our whole selves, we bring our personal culture. And if we're not aware of our personal culture and the fact that we even have a personal culture, then what are we bringing in that we're aware of with which we're perceiving the other person in? Then there are blinders on, there's stereotypes, there are biases, there's competencies and sensitivities. There's no humility. The humility isn't even present with which to engage another, let alone their grief experience, and let alone our own selves. I call this the entering. We enter with our personal culture, and we are received by somebody else's personal culture. And speaking to my homeland, Canada, no other in my place, I did a lot of traveling, and I maybe arrogantly or pride-filled or humbly say, I've never seen the measures of diversity that we have in Canada. I've never seen the impact of diversity on grieving as I've seen in Canada. So we must have a culturally humble approach. Look at all the violence and hate and trauma that's experienced, that is in our legacy, in our history. I don't have to tell you, it's all over the news right now. That's not the focus of today. But it comes down to us as looking at our personal culture, even as a nation, each and every one of us, because it begins with us, as Dr. Like said. And we have to look at all the influences. This is just a reiteration, like almost evidence that how the influences of social media and Netflix and all these other aspects influence each and every one of us differently, because we have a different level of receptivity, a different aspect of traumatization, a different education, a different values, each and every one of us. And all this is interfaced and interacted with grief and loss. I love some of the work by Jesse Thistle. He wrote a book called From the Ashes about his experience as a Métis Indigenous man. And he talks about finding my way. And he doesn't necessarily mention it, but he talks about trauma and traumatization and grief through his own lens, through his own personhood. And I can't think of a better representation than his book and his experiences of personal culture and culture humility through the lens of grief, loss, and homelessness. He wrote also a paper, his thesis on Indigenous homelessness, as the definition of Indigenous homelessness as differentiated from Canadian definition of homelessness. It's so interesting how the Indigenous definition of homelessness has such personal culture in it when it comes to loss. If you want to learn about personal culture and culture humility and loss and all its domains and encompasses, read Jesse Thistle's work on the Indigenous definition of homelessness. We've totally missed it in the Canadian definition. Again, we just have to look at the world around us. When it comes to the foundational principles of even anti-racism, I talked about June Caldwell in a minute, of anti-racism, And Abraham X. Kendi speaks about anti-racism and the foundation of anti-racism being self-reflection, self-awareness, and self-critique. And that is personal culture, and that is cultural humility. And that's what we need to look at with all the loss we're seeing in the world today and the grief. You know, we titled it Cultural Humility and Grief for a reason, because we want to get it out of not just death and dying. We want to look at grief where the majority of grief is in living. And yet we have no real approaches, or not that we don't have it, we're not utilizing the approaches with which to navigate that grief, as it affects each and every one of us differently. This is an example of personal culture. People were asked, she did an interview, she wrote this book was written about her. They were asked, you know, because June Colwood didn't have a funeral. She didn't want a funeral, right? They asked her, do you believe in God? She says, I believe in kindness. Part of her personal culture was as self-defined by her in kindness. And a great interview was with George Stroumboulopoulos from CBC when he was back on the CBC. And he spoke to her idea of personal culture in a roundabout way. And he went through the ideology of culture, he went through religion, he went through work, and she came back and she hit him home. She says, kindness. And through all the losses she was experiencing, everything she grieved, her personal culture, in the approach of cultural humility that George, I felt inadvertently, unconsciously used with her, was kindness. And that's an amazing interview. If you folks see it, it's on YouTube. It was her last interview before she died a couple weeks later. It's an example of personal culture, cultural humility, as it interfaces with grief and loss. Now, practicing cultural humility begins with asking really ourselves, am I self-reflective? And I'm going to give you some tools of how to work with this. And I'm glad it's recorded and you can have these slides by all means, and you can contact me. Am I self-reflective? Do I know my personal culture? Not from 10 years ago, but today, right here, right now. Because what happened to me a couple of days ago influences what I'm doing right now, okay? Am I clear about my personal values, my beliefs, my thoughts, and my feelings in a particular situation right here, right now? If there's ever a practice of mindfulness, start looking at your personal culture. You don't have to sit and meditate, although that's a practice that I'm engaged in. Just look at your personal culture. And even more so, look how your personal culture expresses itself through your losses and how you grieve. And how does your values and beliefs affect how you perceive others? What are your biases? What are your sensitivities? What are your triggers? Especially in respect to expression of personal culture within the framework of grief. And I ask you, although it's sometimes very challenging, I find our most authentic self is expressed when we are grieving. That's when our personal culture is at its most apparent. And the tool, the most valuable tool we bring to our work and to the care, is our genuine selves. What I mean by genuine is authentically a personal expression of our own culture, who and what we are. We cultivate a sense of not knowing the answers. And that's especially apparent in grief and grieving. We ask to be educated using the teach me method. And I actually, this sounds really weird, but I actually use that even to myself. I'm like, I try to teach myself. I try to become humble and learn from myself, especially at times of loss. And those are very challenging times, but those are, and I hope I say this sensitively, those are times for opportunity for when we learn most about our personal culture. We become aware most about our personal culture is at times of loss and at times of grief. And that's usually when I learn most about others. Is I suspend, you know, my need to create any kind of constructs with which how I engage somebody and remain in that state of not knowing and receive from them how they're navigating their grief. And something I do, or I try to advocate very strongly for, I listen inwardly and outwardly, but not just with my ears and my mind and my heart, but my body, like sensory wise. Part of cultural humility is to recognize how is your body interfacing with the environment. When I talk about when I enter somebody's home or somebody's room or somebody's story, I pay attention to how viscerally, sensory wise, my body changes. That grounds me in the moment. It gives me a feel, a sense of the static electricity around a bed. And also what I'm receiving when I'm hearing somebody. I do a lot of grief support on the phone. When I'm hearing somebody in the tone of their voice, when they're expressing their grief and their state of bereavement. There's a lot of work being done, especially with Dr. Peter Levine and Gabor Mate and a host of others, on how grief, trauma, all lives within our bodies. That is part of our personal culture that can't be taught or culturally competent or culturally sensitive or on an intake form, or on Google, because it's even in our bodies, and our bodies are very unique in how it harbors and holds that emotion and those thoughts. And one of the foundational, I love saying that word, one of the most impactful aspects and influences on personal culture is traumatization. I'm going to leave that with you there. I teach a lot of trauma-informed care within death care and grief and bereavement. Traumatization is not just accidents and violence and murder and war. It's everyday life. It is anything that will overpower and overwhelm our nervous system. It is anything that will switch us from hyperarousal to and hypervigilance and hypoarousal from our steady state. And that could be grieving. And if grief results in an aspect of a triggering of a traumatization within our hearts and bodies and minds, then it lends itself to an influence on our personal culture. And we can't access that without a culturally humble approach. And as I mentioned with Ibram X. Kendi, I love this book personally. I'm just advocating for it, but I'm representing myself. And he spoke, we talk about racism and anti-racism. There's a principle to it, a personal culture principle to it, a culturally humble approach to it, which is self-examination, self-critique, and self-awareness of our own biases, our own prejudices, our own conditioning that we see the world. In my mind, and in my humble opinion, a basis of any anti-racism approach or anti-oppressive approach is cultural humility. And today in society, I think across the world, we are truly at an intersection. We're at an intersection of how best appropriately to navigate grief, to teach it, to individualize it, to be aware of it, to diversify it. And I can't think of a more appropriate approach than cultural humility. And one tragedy that exemplifies that is the Orlando massacre a few years ago. And I'll read you a quote. I want to read you a quote. It's called "The Pulse of the Power of Queer Tears. If there's a distinctive power to queer grief, it lies in the styles of mourning that emerge from queer cultures over time. These styles set the shape and tone of the activism that comes out of grief. And activism, of course, is itself a type of mourning. We must examine how queerness behaves when it is at a loss, how a community grieves can tell us a lot about who they are and who we are. I love this paragraph by Brian Lauder because it speaks to when activism, like we don't look at grief and it results in activism, it's entrenched in personal culture. It's entrenched in the individuality of who and what we are, as exemplified by Pulse and the Power of Queer Tears. There's an exercise I would welcome you to do, and although I'm running out of time, I will not do with you today, of course, and I do this in most of my training and most of my education, and that is draw your personal culture. I ask people, sometimes I set them up, really, I shouldn't tell you this, but I kind of set them up in my trainings. I go, let's have a definition of culture, and they give me all these reasons: language, food, ethnicity, where you're from, and all these kinds of stuff, right? And then we suspend that, and then I move over and I say, let's talk about personal culture. Draw your personal culture. So it activates a different aspect of their minds. And I ask them to draw a personal culture at the time of a significant loss in their lives. So it activates even the grief response. And you should see the stuff that comes out. Very, very different. Then we compare. This is the aspect of personal culture as exasperated or drawn out by a loss and the grief that ensues. And this is your ideology of culture. Why is there a difference? It's because we added the personhood here. And that personhood was exemplified by an experience of loss and the ensuing grief. Try it sometime. Try it with somebody that is unsuspecting as you might not be now. It's very simple. Cultural humility is about embracing the individual. And if we embrace the individual, every single one of us would experience loss differently, will grieve uniquely, and will have it change who and what we are in a sense of personhood. Thus, bottom equation is personal culture. And there's this movement that happens with us as we look at it from a personal culture perspective, and all the influences that I've shared with you today in a becoming. We are becoming each and every day, each and every moment. a dynamis, a change, a potentization of our personhood. And that has with it the impacts and the influences of our grief, and can be perceived and supported through a culturally humble approach. Honestly, it's like a perfect storm. I advocate so strongly for you to look at this. If we just spend maybe 45 minutes, an hour today. Look at a video. There's a YouTube video. Just type in cultural humility, part 1, part 2. The individual on it is amazing in terms of how she speaks about cultural humility. And try it in your lives. Try it in your workplaces. Try it with if you're involved in any aspect of death care or grief and bereavement support. Bring it there, and work with it. I'm very honored. Next week, I'm speaking at an organization in BC. It's a treatment center, an old ED of mine, and he's brought me in to talk to this group about cultural humility. That's where it started to seep into, starting to go into all avenues of our social services. I don't know if I have time for this. I want to really show you this video. I'm going to check with Kelsey, Nicole. What do you think, Kelsey, Nicole? I got 5 minutes. We got time, or?
Yeah, I think we're okay to share it, Rami. Let's see.
All right, cool. All right, I want to share this with you folks. I had the honor and privilege of being a part of this music video where we've taken a story that happened to me almost 20 years ago, and it really changed my personal culture. It really infused my personal culture, and I'm telling it 20 years later in the work that I'm doing now. And these famous artists came together and created this music video using the story I did, and they put it to songwriting. And this is what they came up with. You might recognize Biff Naked, Gerald the Young, and Asante in this production. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you can hear it. So just let me know, Kelsey and Nicole, if you can't hear it.
Back to Cypher, the show that takes caregiving stories and turns them into songs. In this episode, we collaborate with Junior T, Jarrell the Young, and
me. Junior was recently shortlisted for this year's Polaris Music Prize, and he's Jesse Reyes' tour DJ.
And Jarrell is a multi-platinum producer who's worked with Fall Out Boy, David Guetta, and he's just dropped a solo project.
So let's check it out. Ready? Dying is hard to talk about. But as caregivers, we need to have these conversations. And our friend Rami thought we could learn from a past client that he referred to as Alka.
How does it go?
Bring it back to the top.
Alka is a pharmacist assistant. She had trained overseas, came here, and had to overcome a lot of racism.
Rami's assigned to try and help Alka, who's working full-time, running her household, and trying to help her dad. She's drowning.
To surrender his care to someone else doesn't fit her cultural values.
That's just not how they do things.
She couldn't do it.
Nah, bro.
So what about us?
My mom was also a caregiver.
My dad, he was in palliative care.
I've had a number of family members pass away.
Mental health challenges have come and gone throughout my entire career.
Each of us relate to this story in unique ways. But bottom line, we all relate to it.
So many ways to say the same message.
Watching my hero fall apart while my babies grow. Weight of the world on my shoulders trying to break me slow.
Maybe pitch down.
I'm with that.
She says, I'm feeling really sad, but at the same time angry.
It just feels so deeply unfair.
Death does not always come quickly.
She said, I feel he's died before he's died.
You're almost like paralyzed.
Am I going crazy?
You're so underprepared for that actual goodbye. It's exhausting.
And I'm losing the time, losing my prime. When you get used to this life, who wouldn't cry? I'm losing my mind.
And I say, no, Alka, you're not going crazy. You're a caregiver that's burnt out, and the anticipation of death can create feelings before he's died.
I never really thought that you could grieve before someone died.
And that's like a lot of energy to give.
I'm learning so much.
Aspects of mental health start to creep in, right? Depression, anxiety, low sex drive, sleeplessness.
Some things never change when emotions need expressing. Trust is to be gained. That's right. It's hard to be this strong when every day words can't express the love underneath the pain.
Leading up to his death, the potency of her emotion became stronger and stronger.
Is this the moment we've been dreading?
And I said, Alka, Raj asked me a very challenging question.
This is the moment we've been waiting for.
I told her that he asked me, is this what it feels like to die?
The curtain falls, and all the lights
broke down, and she was in full anticipatory grief. But there was a moment, she talked, a moment of stillness, where it was just him and her. His breath slowed down. He died in her arms, and then she just held him.
No more pain, no more sorrow, no more moments to exchange. Feel these feelings throughout me. Tomorrow won't be the same. No more pain, no more sorrow, no more moments to explain. Though I feel you around me, I won't forget, no regrets. So goodbye till we meet again.
When I saw Elka, there wasn't much tears. She said, you know, because I had the chance to feel my feelings, Rami, at the end, the grief wasn't as complicated or as harbored.
Today, we share some deeply personal feelings about caregiving for someone who's dying.
Good grief, it's the good grief.
And we came out the other side stronger.
It actually changed the entire song.
Yeah, that's it.
Can you sing it again if you don't mind?
Yeah.
So goodbye till we meet again. So goodbye till we meet again.
Nobody presents it like this. This can help break down the barriers. Life's work, man. To be able to be a part of this, you know, I got touched. Thank you for watching that. More on a website called Stories for Caregivers. Lots of good stuff on there in the plight of caregivers, especially a lot of it is very tactful in a cultural humility perspective, funded by the TELUS Fund. So lots of good stuff in there. And that's my time today with you folks. I will stick around hopefully for 10 or 15 minutes to answer some questions. But that's my contact information if you'd like to check out my website and send me an email about any questions, anything you think. I'm very, very interested in advocacy and supporting your whatever you might come with. All right. So thank you very much.
Wow, I'm still like, I have goosebumps from that song, Rami. So I mean, yeah, we can't thank you enough for coming and sharing your passion and knowledge on this important topic. And what you've shared today is so invaluable. I can see why you these sessions that you hold are usually, 2, 3, 4 hours long and not. We just scratched the surface today. So yeah, we'll definitely post the recording along with your contact information and your website and things like that, so that if people want to learn more, they can go there to check it out. So thank you. We did have a few questions come in, so I'll read them out here. So a lot of great comments as well. Thank you for this phenomenal presentation. Someone here is wondering what your thoughts are regarding having specific loss type bereavement groups. So like MAID groups or suicide, bereaved parents is another example. So do you feel this contributes to the issue of insensitivity around culture by separating these loss types?
No, actually, when it comes, it's because within those loss types, it's a peer support model, right? Sometimes, but when we talk about personal culture and the expression of personal culture, it can happen within, and I think I mentioned this right at the beginning, it could happen within the greater context of a category, but it's not the category, right? Mm-hmm. So somebody who's in a greater context, for example, we're working on grief support for people who identify or who are Muslim or who identify as queer or whatever. But within that, there's the expressions and focus on personal culture. You can definitely categorize, like I am Canadian, but it's part of my personal culture, but it's not necessarily how I am being engaged. So absolutely. There was another question I saw on there. I hope that helps. No, I think absolutely. I'm part of them, right? I just think we have to be mindful with the domains of diversity. Like I saw one group was a brothers and sisters group. But what happens with all the other identities, right?
Yeah.
So I have to be mindful of that. But when it comes to peer support, I think it's important that we have those types of groups because it facilitates, but still the intersection is through a culturally humble approach. I saw one quick question, if I could speak with Nicole, if I've worked with anybody who's been incarcerated.
Yeah,
absolutely. I've worked, Unfortunately, in Canada, it's a little different in terms of being able to go into jails and what have you, but people who have come out and lived, absolutely, yeah, for sure. And that, that in and of itself, the trauma of being incarcerated, the trauma of the legal system, the trauma of what they might have done and feel for, that infuses their personal culture as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's so interesting. I'm sure you have tons of stories.
Well, if I can make a quick plug, just check out the movie called Serving Life. Check out the movie Serving Life. Throw it up there.
I'll make a note.
Amazing. Amazing.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll make a note so that we can post that in our follow-up email. A few questions or comments. That was a fantastic webinar. A big thank you for all the information you shared. Another one, Rami, thank you for your presentation today. I could easily spend the whole day listening to you.
Don't give me that. I'll do it.
Yeah.
Lisa,
oh my gosh.
Lisa had a really good point I want to speak to. Can you read that one out quickly?
Yeah, is there a way to offer grief support or volunteer training, exposure to death and grief practices from different religions or cultures without it ending up being a practice in cultural competence instead of humility? How can that learning be framed better?
Beautiful question, Lisa. Absolutely. And that's what we do in a lot of death care settings. I'm doing it at ITM next weekend. I've done it here. I've done it. And that part of that is the cultural humility training. And we do it, it's like 3 or 4 hours of intensive, not so much intensive training, but it's education, skill building, knowledge, and really dismantling of our biases and our perceptions. It can absolutely be done. Like in that exercise of draw your personal grief. We start there, we start there, and then we offer opportunity for people to share with us what they want and how they want it. And it can have ritual, it can have customs, it can have family, but it comes from them and then we afford them the autonomy and the self-direction to maybe not go exactly the same way they've been expected of. So absolutely, there is a full training right now. You ever interested? I'm sharing it with lots of different places. Let me know, hit me up, send me an email and I'll tell you where you can go to learn it. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Another question is for those, you kind of just said, but for those who want to learn more on their own about cultural humility, especially in relation to grief, do you have any recommendation on like books or videos that you usually recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. Who is that? So I can address them by name.
I'm not sure. It came in earlier.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
Sorry.
Whoever that might be. Yes, absolutely. You see, the trick is, in a lot of my learning, it has been piecemeal. I go learn this. I learn cultural humility. I study grief. I bring it to death. I bring it to and you have to kind of do that in death care, like in grief and bereavement support, however we're defining this field. You have to go and search for the information. So there's a lot of great. Again, email me. I'll send you the articles, the publications, the books. Just look on YouTube. Cultural humility. Great 3 or 4 part YouTube piece. Check out PalCare. PalCare is doing a lot of teaching on cultural humility. I'm part of that group. Check out some of the bigger presentations we're doing. You could check out ITM, Institute of Traditional Medicine, or just very simply send me an email and I could tell you where to go. Unfortunately, there isn't really a link between, that's my job here. That's why I'm here today, right?
Yeah.
To share with you cultural humility as it applies to grief, as it applies to death and traumatization. We kind of have to piece it together. We have to write a book about that. We have to bring that forth because it's not out there. We're picking pieces and trying to intersect them and apply them to one another. So, but it's moving. It's a moving ahead.
Yeah, well, this is a great start, and we'll definitely share, like I said, your website, and which I'm sure obviously has your contact information. So if people want to reach out, they can do so. We have another comment. Thank you for your passion and humility. I will do my best to move forward to be my genuine self. And then another question about resources. And so, yeah, we will be posting the resources that Rami mentioned throughout his presentation, that they're easily accessible. That's it for questions. I don't see any more coming in. A lot of great comments. So I'll just take this time to thank you again for joining us today. This is our last session of our grief literacy campaign, and I think we went out with a bang. That was so good. So thank you again for coming, and for everyone for coming over the last 6 weeks. And yeah, everyone be well and stay safe, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks again. And thanks, Rami.
Stay safe.
Bye.
There.